So today we're going to look at understanding transgender persons' experience in the labour market. My name is Damien Cassells. I'm with the School of Business at Maynooth University. And Dr Klavs Ciprikis is here this morning. Klavs is going to do the majority of the heavy lifting because this is a byproduct of his own PhD, which I supervised with another colleague who's present here this morning, Dr Jenny Berrill from Trinity Business School. So we'd really like Klavs to showcase what he's done, and we can offer our opinions before and after. Okay, so Klavs, you can move on to the first slide, and we'll have just a general overview of what we've done. So the area of gender as it pertains to the male and female traditional labeling, shall we say, of gender and the labour market is very well covered. Now, there's still a good bit of mystery around it in terms of understanding pay gaps, for example, is still a hot topic, and there's new research each year coming out on that. But studies that focus studies that include the transgender community are sparse. And that was the primary reason behind this. So I had been reviewing labour market reports for the ESRI for quite a while, and it never dawned on me, probably because I was trained as a labour economist, so I was used to seeing gender as being controlled by either being male or female. So it never really dawned on me that we weren't addressing this issue or this question, that we were just, this is what we'd always done, so why wouldn't we continue to do this? But I'm also a psychotherapist, and I'd say it was around, I'd say 2016, 2017, I started to notice clients coming in with questions around their gender. So it was becoming a topic that people were openly discussing in therapy, at least, if not in schools, amongst themselves. So that I suppose that prompted some thought in me as well, like, what, God, if people are coming to therapy and they're suffering, and part of the suffering is because of their struggle with their own gender identity, and then how as a society we're meeting this or not meeting it, perhaps in a lot of cases we're just ignoring it. That kind of prompted that thought, and I was out for a walk one day, and I don't know, I have to do something about this, and I got back, and it's all timing, of course. That was August, and it was June. There'd been a kind of a forum in UCLA, and they kindly put all their information up online, and they had come up with 2 data sets globally that were controlling for gender in a non-binary way, and that were looking at the labour market. So I got on to Klavs immediately. So Klavs was already working on his PhD, and we were looking at marginalised groups in the labour market. So our initial focus was on people who had mental health issues, and seeing how were they getting on the labour market relative to people who didn't have those issues. So the concept fit it right in. The methodologies that Klavs were using were completely aligned. It was just more a question of data, and that was our initial concern, was where are we going to get the data. So UCLA identified 2 data sets. I checked them both. One didn't have enough variables to conduct a labour market study, and the other just about did. And for that reason, we pushed on. We knew from a research perspective, we knew there was other research controls that we would have liked to have in the models. But the trade-off is standing around waiting for the world to change or lay a marker down. So that's what we decided to do. Look, we'll put together our best attempt at a labour market study, given the restrictions that we face with the actual data that's being collected. So in terms of risk, then, so I've got supervisor, PhD, student concerns, and risk versus reward. So it is risky. So you're going into an area where there's very few papers written. So the people are back then as well, like in 2018, 2019, 2020, people were looking at the transgender questions from a research perspective, but the data was quite weak. And also, Klavs was registered as a PhD student in a business school, so there's a risk involved in taking your work away from kind of mainstream concepts. But we both felt it was worth the risk, because the rewards were very high in terms of producing this work. So that was the type of conversations we were having at the time. In terms of conferencing and publication experiences with this work in general, generally good as long as you go to the right type of conference. I mean, sometimes, like, I find, say, this is one of the two areas I'm interested in. The other is well-being and mental health. So if you bring well-being or mental health to a very linear kind of economics conference, people won't necessarily see the value of what you're doing. Likewise with journals, Klavs might get to speak a little bit about this later on, but in relation to journals, any journal that was interested in the work were incredibly supportive. And Klavs' second paper is in small business economics, and we almost felt the reviewers and the editorial team were it felt like they were more invested in the work than we were at the end, because they really got it and they wanted it to be just so, and it is just so as a result. So I think, again, you have to pick your target audience. I think we were getting, with the second paper, we got 1 or 2 instant rejections, and I think that's based on the concept, and these were American-based journals that probably felt the trade-off for them taking on a transgender paper was too much. But again, once we found our right audience, the rest kind of flowed, as it were. Impacts then, I'll come back to the research impact after Klavs has spoken. There's a more immediate impact then that I get to see in the classroom, and that I can use this as part of my teaching. I can show the students what we're doing. They get to see that people in Ireland are interested in this, and that people globally are interested in this. So that gives students then the power to come forward and speak about their own experiences, whether it's to do with gender or something else. That if they feel there is a maybe disconnect between what's happening in society and their experiences, it enables them to speak. And again, we'll refer to the research impacts later on once Klavs has gone through what he's done with the work. So that was our first attempt, and you can see the actual images from the journal Gender, Work and Organisation, and that's where the initial work ended up. Again, the journal were a joy to deal with. That was our first submission. We hadn't tried anywhere else with that paper, and again, they treated us really, really well throughout the process and helped us strengthen the work that was there. The second paper then was we wanted to figure out what was going on for transgender people who were self-employed. So again, a slightly different target audience, but like again, just widening the lens in terms of seeing. Let's look how the transgender community are getting on as it pertains to the economy in itself. So it was kind of a natural progression. That was a bit of a harder sell. A lot of the entrepreneurship journals are American based, so it was kind of a little bit more difficult to get traction with that. But again, once we got traction, small business economics were superb. There was a conference in Dublin in June 2024, and we met a lot of people there as well, and a lot of journal editors that are super interested in this work. But it was a well-being and entrepreneurship conference. So again, the target audience is very much aligned with our own interests. So it's good to know that these communities exist and that they're very supportive of the work. In terms of what's next, so Klavs, I think, will point to what we're working on at the minute. But there's what we're seeing in both the research, but again, back as being a therapist, I'm seeing it with clients, is that at times there can be a mental health penalty if you've got gender identity issues. So this seems to be coming up as an issue. So our next step is to see, is that translating into the data yet? Well, first of all, have we enough data to see if there's a relationship? And secondly, if that's showing up yet in the data, that it's possible that, like, in much the way that how we, like, I suppose with a hint of shame, how we handled homosexuality in Ireland in the past would have came with a mental health impact for homosexual people in Ireland. I think at the moment, because, and Klavs will probably get into this, because we're really not getting to the heart of this yet from a research perspective, there may well be a penalty as well being faced by people who have gender identity questions. So that's where the work is going next. It'll be interesting to see the response from conferencing and journals, because again, it's moving on a notch. It's one thing to look at people in the labour market, and then when you start bringing in mental health, it raises other questions as well. but I think we're determined to push on with that. So with that, then I'll introduce you to Klavs. So Dr. Klavs Ciprikis is currently working as a researcher with the House of Oireachtas. Prior to that, he was with the researcher with the ESRI. He's also adjunct staff at Trinity Business School, and I was his supervisor along with Dr. Jenny Berrill for his PhD. So Klavs is going to go through the two publications I discussed, and he will also, I think, give you an outline of where we're going next with this work. And then when that's done, if there's anything that Klavs has left out that I feel is important, I'll give it a quick sweep around, and then we can have a conversation if people want about that. So over to you, Klavs.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Damien. I'm very happy to be here as well for Social Justice Week and covering something this important. I think transgender experiences in society and labour markets is important element and is necessary to be discussed and shared, especially now more than ever with loads of things happening around the world. Considering transgender people, this is very important to bring up and to talk more about it. Now, what my kind of contribution here would be specifically looking at the labor markets. But before we go jump into that and the research that we have done on the labor markets and trans identity, we need to kind of highlight that understanding and acceptance and awareness of transgender identities has increased over the years, right? This is something that's not completely new, and people are more accepting, understanding of what it means to be transgender and the experiences of transgender people in society. However, the stigma and this resulting discrimination still persists. It is still strong in our society. We see and read about trans people reporting very high levels of mistreatment, harassment, and violence in all parts of their lives, which is unfair and needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Having said that, also we have a lot of trans groups in Ireland specifically focusing on this, internationally as well, coming from the Irish Parliament, research groups as well, politicians, other kinds of members are interested in this kind of space, and they are looking for research, they're looking for input on trans experiences in society. So we are on a right trend in this country specifically, but we need more. We need more help in these kinds of areas. So I will briefly go over to some of the trans experiences in society, but the main focus of this will be on our two papers that Damien commented at the beginning, which is looking at labor market experiences, so specifically employment and wages of transgender people, as well as then the second part of research, which is looking at self-employment and how what impact might that have on transgender people's incomes, as well as mental health, which is the future of this research. So we're looking at the specific lens at labor market outcomes of transgender people today. Before we start, just some definitions, again, just briefly for those who want to know a little bit more about this, that it's important to understand that sex and gender are not the same. Right? So sex, biological sex in terms of chromosomes, hormones or genitalia is one element, and gender on the other side is a social construct. So it essentially links biological sex to some sort of social construct, typically that is comes in expression of men and women. Right? So they're not the same, but they are linked. What this means for our purposes is that basically, where does the word transgender come from? People transitioning to gender. What's important to understand here is that a gender is a spectrum, right? You can be from one end, you have a man and a woman, and you can have all sorts of gender identities in between. Some people don't identify with any one of those genders, and that's one of the variables. That's one of the gender identities that we have used, is this kind of non-gender, non-conforming individuals in our research that I will be commenting on as well. So it's important to understand that sex is not the same as gender, and the gender is a spectrum. When we're talking about transgender people, transgender is often used as an umbrella term to refer to individuals who do not entirely identify with the sex and or gender they were assigned at birth. So the individual assigned their gender based on their biological features at birth the people who do not identify as that gender later in their life will transition to appropriate gender and may be referred to as transgender individuals. On the other hand, you have cisgender people, so people who do identify with a gender that they were assigned to at birth, right? So if you were assigned a female at birth, you might identify a woman later in life. You are a cisgender woman. So those are very general terms. This is just to get us through the kind of general understanding. The most common kind of gender identities are transgender men, right? So these would be persons, like female person born with maybe female biological features that does not feel like a woman later in life, and they are transitioning socially or themselves to be a man. So that's a transgender. They would be transgender men. Transgender woman would be a person who's born and assigned male at birth and then identify as a woman. And people who were assigned one or the other gender at birth but do not identify with either one of them later in life would maybe refer to themselves as non-binary, or that they're non-conforming, gender non-conforming. So that's just to get us through some of the general definitions of our gender identities to help us out in our research elements. Okay, so then we could jump into our research. I'm just checking here. Sorry. Trying to figure out how to. My keyboard wasn't working properly there, so I'm just looking at if I did all the slides correctly. So okay, so we're looking at our research, and what's important to highlight here is that about less than 1%, so 0.5 to 1% of the population are transgender. This is around the world. So depending on jurisdiction, you kind of this is how what a kind of minority group transgender people are, and they're arguably the most mistreated group as well in any society around us. So trans people often face strong stigma and discrimination in just everyday lives. For example, we're being here at the Maynooth University's Social Justice Week. In education, for example, trans people are significantly more likely to experience verbal harassment, physical harassment, or sexual assault than any other gender group. In terms of funding, so this might not apply so much to Ireland because we have such good laws around this, but in America, where this research is coming from, funding is oftentimes denied to transgender people for their education based on their gender identity, but not even if they state that they are trans, or even perceptions about person's gender. Maybe their birth certificate does not match whatever documentation they submit now, therefore they might be denied funding for their education. So that's the form of structural discrimination we're looking at, institutional discrimination essentially. Similarly, in terms of healthcare as well, we find that from previous literature, we find that more than 30% of transgender people delay getting help or seeking healthcare because they are of fear of discrimination in the healthcare sector. This lack of understanding of transgender healthcare stems from that. People don't want to go if they know the doctor is not going to understand them. And more specifically in Ireland, we're actually one of the worst in the world for transgender healthcare. We know we used to have this institution here that's being reformed now, where the waiting lists are of decades long to get transgender healthcare, and rightly so, communities and groups, trans advocacy groups, have complained about this, and this is being reformed. This is coming from the Irish Parliament, as well as working together with the groups, the transgender groups, to reform healthcare. Many of our healthcare so-called professionals don't understand transgender health. They don't know how to help transgender people. So, these people are stuck in a limbo of not being able to get any help, and that's completely unacceptable, and that is on the change, and that needs to change in the future. Similarly, in terms of family structures, so oftentimes families are not very accepting of trans people or gender diverse people as well. So people might face abuse or withholding of important resources like healthcare and education, especially when they're underage as well. Things that could help a person in their life are withheld from them. So they face this kind of the abuse at home as well. I have a comments here on the justice system. More specifically, this comes again American data. In America, this is more prevalent than here, but here we hear reports from trans advocacy groups as well that in the justice system, police exert far greater violence towards transgender people, and they harass them more often so than not. And even somebody who might be perceived as transgender, they experience way more harassment than somebody who is not perceived as being trans. And in the actual prison system itself in America, very importantly there, but so also in Ireland as well, people might be put into a prison system that does not match their gender identity, you know. So there's issues with that need to be reformed. And finally, we have this cis-normative culture, right? So you're a cisgender man, you're a cisgender woman. Look at the bathrooms in our universities or public spaces. You know, there oftentimes are for men and women, and there's oftentimes no kind of gender neutral or gender diverse bathrooms, for example, right? And this is not just that, also passports. You know, you have two genders, male and female, a man and woman, and all the birth certificates, all the census that we all fill in, they always contain two categories. But we do know that the gender is a diverse social construct that is important to address. So there's a lot of work still to be done in society overall. But we do also find that these kind of cis-normative culture around gender also impacts labor markets, and specifically what kind of jobs people can go into, what kind of career development they might have. They're very gender jobs that we have, and people are, you know, pushed into or pulled out from those jobs continuously. So our research specifically then looks at these kind of labor market elements. So we will kind of put aside the social elements. We'll more specifically look at labor market outcomes. So here, the last point on the slide, you can see the trans labor market experience. This comes from previous literature, where we find that 90% of trans people experience mistreatment or discrimination on the job. So most people will have some sort of mistreatment purely based on their gender identity. 47% report being fired, not hired, or denied a promotion, while another 27% are on low earnings, so earning less than $20,000 a year or $25,000 or 25,000 euros a year. So low earning people, and so this kind of gave us the kind of information that we need to see. Look, if in the labor market trans people are so much more worse off than cisgender people, we want to see, can we analyze those income gaps in a little bit more detail? Can we understand them? Why do wages differ between transgender people and non-transgender people or cisgender people? So two elements to this piece of work is the employment outcomes and wage outcomes. So first, we're going to look at the employment outcomes. So 58% of cisgender people are employed compared to 47% of trans people who are employed. So that's an employment gap of about 11%. Far more trans people are unemployed or in self-employment, which is very interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And obviously, there is this kind of employment gap. So we want to understand what are the reasons for it. So the quantitative economists that we are, we look at the links, the statistical links between gender and employment. So we want to see, is there any statistical link which regarding your gender identity and if your employment outcome. So trans women, trans men, and cisgender women are significantly less likely to be employed when compared to equivalent cisgender men. So when the cisgender men are compared to these other gender groups, the other gender groups are, and you can see the percentages here, 28, 27, 16% less likely to be employed than cisgender men. So it gives us an indication that there is some sort of statistical link between gender and employment. The other important element here is to look at that 11% employment gap and ask, what is the reason for it? You know, why is there an employment gap? As Damien brought up earlier, a significant, or not significant, all of the previous literature in this area and just surrounding gender has always been about men and women, right? So we don't know anything kind of more detailed apart from that. So looking at the gaps between trans people and cisgender people is the next step that we want to look at. So how much of that 11% can be explained by differences in socio-demographic and employment characteristics of individuals? So how much of that 11% can be explained by changes, by differences in education, experience, work characteristics between transgender people and cisgender people? So we want to see if can we attribute any of that to those characteristics. And we find that about a third or 34% of the employment gap can be explained by differences in those characteristics. So a third of that 11% can be explained mainly by education and health-related functional limitations. This means that essentially trans people reported lower levels of educational attainment. So many, because again, there's this kind of structural discrimination in education, many trans people don't go beyond high school or secondary school. So more trans people than cisgender people would have the highest level of education as secondary school or primary school. And if you're a cisgender man or a woman, you would more likely to be in the higher education setting, so college or university. So that explains part of the reason why trans people are less likely to be employed. Another potential reason is health-related functional limitations. So this is due to physical or mental health, and mental health is another one we're going to be looking at in a few moments. Due to physical health or mental health, does that impact a person's employment opportunities and their employment levels more so? And the answer to that is yes. So trans people are more likely to report functional limitations that impact their employment outcomes, and that explains why the employment gap is the way it is as well. So education and healthcare related functional limitations are the main elements explaining that gap. But this also means that, and there's other characteristics as well, but they do not have such a big impact on that employment gap. But this does mean that about 66% or 2/3, what's left over, is unexplained. So this unexplained employment gap may be due to unobserved differences between the trans and cisgender people, or it may be due to potential discrimination. There are characteristics that we cannot observe or that were not recorded by the survey that we are looking at, so they can have an impact of, explain why the employment gap differs. But we have considered everything that we have considered. There's some items that we're missing, but still there is about 2/3 that is unexplained. And if you cannot unexplain that employment gap by any socio-demographic characteristics that are, that are important for employment, that this may be due to potential discrimination in the labor market against transgender people. So that's a key finding here in sense of employment. Moving over to wages. So this is similar question. We're still asking a similar question. Is there a wage discrimination for trans people? Right. So we are looking at those people who are employed only. So now we're looking at the group who are employed, and we want to see by how much do wages differ between the two groups. So first thing to note here is that the income categories that we're working at with are people earning 50,000 or more. So these are the high income earners. And then there are about 4 categories less than 50,000 per year. So 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50,000. So those are the categories we're working, and 50,000 or higher. This is what the data set has given to us. So the focus for us in today's presentation is on the 50,000 or higher category, because in general, for every gender group, most people, or not most, but like a significant proportion, would be in the highest income category. So therefore, we're focusing where the most of the data is on the highest income category. Essentially asking how likely are trans people to be in the highest, or less likely to be in the highest income category than equivalent cisgender persons. So what we find is that trans workers are 11% less likely to receive wages above 50,000 per year when compared to equivalent cisgender men. Right, so the base category is cisgender men, and then you have all the gender categories that are being compared against the cisgender men group. So cisgender men are 11% more likely to be in this income category than transgender people. Again, looking at the decomposition of that wage gap. So this 11% is essentially our wage gap, and we want to see how much of that probability in being in this income category can be explained by differences in wage-related characteristics. So again, we bring in our educations, healthcare, other background demographic characteristics to try to explain what is the reason here, and we find that approximately 76% of the difference can be explained by socio-demographic characteristics. Why the main elements again here being education, so lower levels of education. It means that you maybe don't get as many promotions, so that might be a reason for that. You can also have the functional limitations, maybe taking more work time out of work can impact your wage kind of outcomes as well. Race was another important one. So non-white people, the trans people are in general not more likely to be non-white, but in our example, there's more trans people that are non-white than white, and that impacts as well on their wages that they will receive in the future as well. So there's this kind of inequalities that kind of go through direct inequalities as well as structural inequalities that kind of explain why some of these why the wage gap is the way it is. But this also means that about 24% of the wage gap remains unexplained and may be due to discrimination in the labor market. So again, there's some characteristics that we don't control for, that we don't have information for, like contract type or the type of occupation you go into, that may have an impact on explaining the wages, the wage differences. So we don't have this, and that contributes to this unexplained wage gap. But also discrimination on not being promoted or not being given the next wage bracket, or prevented from when you're getting onto the job into the labor market, the wage you're paid is less than equivalent cisgender, cis men, as well, is an important element, and that we cannot account for that, and that is one of these unexplained potential discrimination variables in our data set. So for both employment and wages, we see that they are different for trans people and cisgender people, and we can see that some of those gaps can be explained, while a significant proportion of 24%, 1/5 of the wages cannot be explained. So that's important areas for policymakers to address, to highlight, as well as for business owners to understand that these kind of structural inequalities not only will impact the productivity of your business, but it will also lower the revenues that you could potentially be earning by treating people right. So that was the research we conducted on the specifically employment and employment outcomes. The second kind of key element here, and Damien brought up the power of self-employment. So what we have observed is that from our literature reading and our own research, is that trans people are subject to strong stigma in the labor market. We saw the mistreatment, the statistics on that. We see on employment differences as well, some of which may be due to discrimination. Same with wage differences that may be due to discrimination. So there is this strong perceived inequality, or maybe potentially perceived discrimination that impacts transgender experiences in the labor market. And what we do find is that a potential avenue and a significant element of this is to kind of counter the labor market experiences, is to enter and choose self-employment to avoid this discrimination. Right, so it might be worth for trans people to go into self-employment to avoid mistreatment in the labor market. And I'm not saying like it might be worth doing that, but the literature would suggest that self-employment is also linked to significant challenges. You bypass different kinds of employment rights. You bypass the minimum wage legislation. You bypass holiday days, things like that. When you go into self-employment, you're employed on your own. There's no kind of employee protections anymore. Wages in general are, if not equal, then better if you are employed overall than for self-employed people as well. So there's this monetary incentive that you may be bypassing or giving up so that you can go into self-employment. But the benefits of self-employment, especially for marginalized groups, minority groups specifically, outweigh those monetary benefits and those risks of employment. So essentially, people going into self-employment have autonomy over their own work. They have choice between who they hire. They have a choice in who they interact with. There's a lot of power to the self that is given by going into self-employment. And minority groups, people from minority groups vouch for that. They say that this is really the case. We bypass these monetary gains so that we can have a better standard of life, standard of living, as well as to improve our mental health overall. And because of that, we wanted to examine then, what is the what are the self-employment differences in our research. Before this, when you look at employment, we also could see that self-employment was was an employment kind of option, and self-employment people, trans people, were very they were higher rates of self-employment. If you look at the overall groups between trans and cisgender people, trans people were more likely to be self-employed than cisgender people. So we wanted to examine that a little bit more. We want to see what are the differences between self-employment rates between the two groups. And we also want to see, can we explain the reasons for entering the self-employment? So I mentioned some of these kind of reasons from the previous literature, but we wanted to kind of put numbers to it. We want to quantify this to see what we can arrive at, and can we explain these differences? And another element of this research is to see, because I brought up income, foregoing income to go into self-employment. What are the income gaps when you go into self-employment between trans and non-trans people? Are you monetarily better or worse off being self-employed than equivalent cisgender people? So that's another element of this research. And finally, the second bullet point on the slide tackles the trans people may experience better mental health outcomes due to self-employment. So something that I briefly mentioned, and this is our future work that we are going to be doing next. At the very end, I'll comment to you on some of the preliminary results of what is the impact of self-employment on mental health, and the self-employment does contribute to better well-being and mental health outcomes. But before that, we're going to quickly look at the self-employment rates. So two slides, one on self-employment rates and the other one incomes from self-employment. So in terms of self-employment, and the groups that we're looking at are the cisgender men, cisgender women, transgender men, transgender women, and transgender non-conforming persons. So this new category, transgender non-conforming individuals, are persons who do not identify or conform to any one of those other genders, but they do identify as transgender in our surveys. So you can see the cisgender men are the self-employment rate of them is about 15.8%, cisgender women 9.1%, the lowest of the group, transgender men at 9.4%, transgender women at 14.9%, and transgender non-conforming individuals at 11.7%. So cisgender men, highest reported self-employment, followed by transgender women, and then by transgender non-conforming individuals. So it kind of backs up what we saw in literature saying that trans people are likely to go into self-employment. And the difference between each of these numbers, and more specifically comparing cisgender men to each one of the other gender identities, is going to be our self-employment gap that we want to examine a little bit further. In terms of statistical relationship between gender identities and self-employment, we find that transgender men and cisgender as women only, so these two categories here only, have a statistical relationship with being self-employed so they're less likely to be self-employed than cisgender men. So these are two categories where we can say that, statistically, trans men and cisgender women are less likely to be employed than cisgender men. While for trans women and trans non-conforming, the results are statistically insignificant. So therefore, they're not more or less likely to be self-employed, which means that they are essentially self-employed at the same rate as cisgender men, statistically speaking. We're looking at the gaps between these rates, and we can say that about 50% of in general, so they vary between 40 to 60%, and the 40 to 60% of the self-employment gaps between cisgender men and all the other trans categories specifically can be explained by socio-demographic characteristics such as age, education, mainly. So these age and education. So age, that trans people in general are younger than cisgender people. So younger people might not have the experience, they might not have the knowledge, they might not have the funding to go into self-employment, while cisgender men who are older, have that going for them. In terms of education as well, so trans people are less likely to have higher levels of educational attainment, less likely to be informed about entrepreneurial practices or how to go into self-employment, are less likely to go into self-employment. So those two elements, those two factors are the main that explain these gaps. But it also means that about 50% of the self-employment gap is unexplained. Again, we don't know the reasons for this exactly numerically, but as I said earlier, the previous literature would suggest that trans people may choose self-employment to bypass the labor market mistreatment and discrimination. Things like that can explain why they go into self-employment. When in self-employment, how do trans people's business perform against the cisgender men's business? So you can see in terms of incomes that you earn from your work, so earning more than 50,000. So cisgender men, 54% of them would earn more than 50,000 compared to 46% of cisgender women, 36% of transgender men, 25% of trans women, and about 35% of transgender non-conforming persons. So there's significant income gaps from self-employment between the transgender groups and cisgender men. What is interesting? So again, you can see that trans people are compared to cisgender people, trans people are giving up on that income, in a sense of earning higher incomes for the benefit, for the non-monetary benefit that self-employment may bring. In terms of statistical relationships, so we're looking at self-employed trans people compared to compared to cisgender men. We find that there is, in general, no statistical relationship between self-employed transgender people and them earning more than 50,000. That means self-employment for trans people does not directly translate into more or less likely chance of earning more than 50,000. While there is one group, which is the transgender non-conforming persons, for them, in fact, there is some, sorry, actually, it's not this group, it is for trans men and cis women. So it is the trans men and cisgender women. They are more likely, these two groups are more likely to benefit monetarily by going into self-employment as opposed or compared to cisgender men. So these two groups are more likely to benefit with higher incomes going into self-employment. Some of the reasons, and again, like 50% is unexplained of this gap, and some of the reasons might be that again, you have a lot of choice in self-employment of who you employ and the customers you deal with. So previous literature would suggest that people from minority groups who are in self-employment, they still face discrimination if you're dealing face-to-face customers, for example, and abuse as well in those settings. When you're not dealing with face-to-face customers, you are kind of, doing something behind the closed doors, doing your trading that way as well. The visibility and the resources for those businesses might not be as high as for somebody who's more open in the business world, which cisgender men and cisgender women would be more likely to do that. So those are some potential explanations for why the wages differ for the self-employed groups. Okay, and then finally, briefly, I want to talk to you about our current work and future work. So we have identified that self-employment helps with kind of to bypass the mistreatment and discrimination in the labor market, which also means that it also may help with mental health outcomes. So I want to say here that discrimination, harassment, and violence faced by trans people negatively impacts their mental health, mainly coming from the employment, from labor markets, while self-employment may improve mental health outcomes. So these are these kind of contrary, pushing back to each other elements. And this is what drew us to this kind of research, especially on self-employment, where the self-employment does bring benefit to trans people, which will counter the negatives that trans people would get from the labor market, from the being employed in the labor market. So we wanted to see what is the statistical kind of links between these. So, and some of the initial results that we have come up with right now, and we can report on these, and we're doing that as we speak almost. So transgender people and cisgender women are more likely to have worse mental health than cisgender men. So overall, we can see the trans people are worse off in mental health and well-being. So mental health here is measured in the form of clinical depression. So if you are ever diagnosed or ever told that you have clinical depression, and also as a mental health days in the last 30 days. So how many days in the last 30 days your mental health was bad or poor? And a third variable, how we measure mental health, is a general health question. So persons were asked what was their general health, which includes physical and mental health. So there's this physical element that kind of distorts the results a little bit, but it's still, mental health is still included there. So those are the primary variables that we are focusing on. We find that self-employment also reduces mental health problems. So if you're self-employed, that will have a statistically significant negative impact on your poor mental health. So therefore lowers your mental health, poor mental health. But what we are focusing on this self-employed trans people, and how does that relate to the mental health outcomes? So self-employed trans people are no better or worse off in terms of mental health than equivalent cisgender men. So when you're self-employed and you're trans, you do not benefit or gain in terms of self-employment, in terms of mental health from self-employment than cisgender men. So you are the same. You get the same in statistical terms, the same experiences as cisgender men, which shows us that and that's an important finding in itself, in a sense that trans people are not worse off from self-employment in terms of mental health, and they are not better than cisgender men. So they are kind of neutral, if you like, and that's an important finding in itself. That self-employment does not deteriorate your mental health. There is one group, which is the transgender non-conforming persons. They may actually experience a reduction in negative mental health outcomes. So being self-employed for transgender non-conforming individuals statistically is linked to lower mental health problems such as clinical depression and mental health days, poor mental health days. So self-employment may actually help. In terms of results, this is how far we gotten so far. We are still exploring other data sets, anything else that we can derive from this, and we're kind of jumping into explanation of why these results, and seeing if we can do any subsequent tests on these in this kind of area. So it's our next or future research that we're going to focus on, specifically looking at the benefits of self-employment for trans people on their mental health and well-being. So I'm going to finish up my contribution. I'll hand you over to Damien in just a few moments. So I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for joining us today for the Social Justice Week, for the initial presentation as well, what I could understand as well. So I'm very happy to present to you today. For the resources, the two papers that we covered are here as well. You can Google them, see what the results are there for yourself. They go into way more detail than we could in just 14 minutes of presentation. So they're just valuable resources for yourselves. So again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.